Hi and welcome back. Today I'll be painting this line and wash, but I'll be using my handmade watercolour paints, which I will be making along with my daughter of Morgana Rose Art as small batch handmade paints in our new Etsy shop, Morgana Rose Art, which is linked below. So if you're interested in looking at our paints, please take a look. And also I've linked Morgana's YouTube channel, Morgana Rose Art, where she will be demonstrating some of the paint making process here for you. So if that interests you, please take a look at our shop and please take a look at Morgana's YouTube channel. These are the colours that will be available in our first batch. Every month or so, we'll be launching a few new colours and slowly building up until we have quite a good and varied range of artist quality watercolour paints, all available in half pans. So why not follow the link below and have a look. So today I'm going to be using a few of our handmade watercolour paints in this line and wash painting of fields, winter fields and winter trees. I'm using Saunders Waterford cold pressed paper. It's taped to my board and my board's at an angle of about 45 degrees. The tape is ordinary decorator's masking tape and my paper is unstretched, and as I paint it'll probably buckle a little bit, but because it's taped to the board it will then flatten out as it dries. My paper is a 1/4 imperial sheet, which is 11 inches by about 15 inches or 28 centimetres by 38 centimetres. And I'm starting off using a ordinary carpenter's pencil, which has got a nice thick lead, and so I can draw sketch very loosely onto the paper these two winter trees and a horizon line and distant hills. Once I am happy with my sketch, the next part of the line and wash process is to go in with waterproof fine liners for the line work. I'm going to be using waterproof Pigma Micron fine liners and Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens, swapping between the two of them from sort of brush pens to very fine liners, depending on the width of line and the amount of coverage that I want. With a line and wash painting, it's a bit different from a pure watercolour because what I'm doing is putting in my darkest darks and really accentuating the darkest darks with my fine liners. And the paint, when it's introduced, will provide me with all my mid-tones and some of my lightest lights. The rest of the lightest lights will be any white of the paper that I leave with maybe dry brush sparkle or little unpainted cloud areas in the sky. But I want to make sure that the details that I put in now with the fine liners sort of almost constitute a finished ink drawing first, and then what that means is that the ink drawing does nearly all the work in the painting, and when I apply the paint I'm literally just putting on a bit of colour here and there to add atmosphere and depth. Now that I've finished the line work, I'll show you the colours that I'm going to be using. I'm using raw sienna, Davidson's grey, cobalt blue and burnt umber. They're all in half pans and I shall just give them a quick spray with a misting spray a couple of minutes before I use them, and they should wet up nicely. I'm going to be using my Escoda Ultimo synthetic round brush. It's like a lovely wash brush with a good point, size 14, and I'm using that to start with, and I'm painting wet onto the dry paper with the raw sienna to give me that lovely pale glow in the sky. And then adding the cobalt blue, which you can see is a beautiful translucent colour, and both of these colours, but especially the cobalt blue, granulate beautifully when mixed with lots of water. So I should get some beautiful effects in this sky as it softens and diffuses. As I work across the sky, the brush is drying out a little bit as the paint transfers onto the paper, and you can see that I'm getting paler washes towards the bottom. I'm being careful not to cover all my paper completely, and leaving a few nice little areas of paler and white paper for the clouds. Working across the sky wash with my clean damp brush to just soften and blend back a bit. It's very important here that you squeeze nearly all the water out of your brush onto a cloth for doing this. If you introduce more water into your wash at this point, you'll end up with producing cauliflowers or runbacks. So make sure that you're using only a very slightly damp brush for this softening. So I think that's just about done for the sky. I'm going to, once I've finished softening back, I will be leaving it to dry completely, just adding a few patches of slightly darker, richer blue across the top. That should all blend and diffuse nicely. It'll just give me that little bit of intensity across the top and behind these wintry trees. So now it must dry completely, and I won't touch it again. It's important to leave a wash like this and not fiddle with it. So here it is, it's dry and it's looking really lovely. There's some nice granulation. There's, beautiful transparent hues within the sky, and I'm very, very pleased with the way it looks. It's a classic sort of old-fashioned English landscape sky, and now I shall continue in the same vein, just roughing in some details. I'm using a small Pro Art Ron Ranson Harkey brush. The small Harkey brush fits perfectly into the pans, and so it's a really good choice if you still want to use a Harkey brush with small half pans rather than freshly squeezed tubes. And as I paint in these distant trees, my mixture of paint is fairly watery because I want to use aerial perspective to give me a sense of distance. So I want my cool blues and browns to be quite varied across that run of background trees, both in height and in hue. So I'm dropping slightly browner paint in parts and slightly bluer in others, and then running the Harkey brush along the bottom just to soften up and neaten up that line of trees. There's a very thin band between that line of distant trees and the shadows that I've created underneath the trees, and with the fine liners and the brush pens, and I want to try and preserve that light and keep that nice and clean, because I think that will give me the impression of some water, maybe a river or a lake in the background. And then with a slightly paler mixture of the same colours, putting in a few areas where the trees are a lot taller in the background. Not too much, just enough. Now this is a rich mixture of my beautiful burnt umber, dragged across the fields horizontally with the Harkey brush to create this beautiful dry brush effect, which gives me the look of my sort of barren winter fields, and sort of the plain earth very, very easily without any trouble. And the dry brush sparkle just adds some sort of light and life to the painting. Now I'm going to be using one of my favourites of the new watercolours. My very favourite is the cobalt blue, but my next favourite is our Davidson's grey, which is sort of a homage to Paynes grey. And it's this beautiful dark grey that's almost black when it's used thickly and richly from the pan with very little water, but it thins out and thins and separates out into a beautiful blue black grey with lots of water. So I'm using that just to add some variety and a nice band of shadow across the foreground, and it really brings the field into focus, just adding little touches of it here and there and starting to bring that path together as well. I'm scratching into the rich paint with the corner of a store card, and that's giving me some foreground grasses, but very, very simply done. And they're kind of, some of them are softening and diffusing into the wet paint. Others are marks are staying there. And it's just a nice, simple way of creating a little bit of detail in the foreground. The stars of the show in this painting, in other words, the focus, are the trees here. Everything else is kind of leading the eye towards the trees and the gentleman walking his dog. So that's just some raw sienna worked into the path with little horizontal sweeps of the brush, and that just warms up that path really, really nicely. Now I'm very pleased with that so far, but I think what I'm going to try and do is just create some a fine mesh of twigs and maybe some little old leaves and things like that, using the dry brush technique and this sort of grey mixture created by the cobalt blue and the burnt umber, and quite a dry mixture, and using my Escoda size 14 Escoda Ultimo brush, I'm just brushing very lightly using the texture of the paper to create just these very loose impressions of the very fine twigs that you find at the very extreme ends of the canopies of these winter trees. It's worth practicing this on a piece of scrap paper to start with, because you have to get the right kind of consistency of paint. If it's too wet, you won't get this dry brush effect, and you have to have quite a light touch with the brush. So as I say, it's certainly worth practicing. And the painting's almost finished now, and it's building up just those last few of the darker mid-tones. So just putting some darker tones at the base of my distant trees, being careful not to cover up the paint that's already there. And that just gives a little bit more emphasis, and it links across the page so that we've got this beautiful composition with these lovely strong verticals created by the trees and the strong horizontal created by the horizon line and the path leading out towards us. Just cleaning up that line a bit with my flat brush. It's a 3/4 inch synthetic Cotman flat brush, series 666. And then just a little bit of a swoosh of paint down the path, down the middle, sort of the trackway, just to create that kind of authentic look of a country path. So I think I'm going to finish it there. I think that's just about okay, and I'm very pleased with that. I'm very pleased with the way our homemade watercolour paints have performed here, but bear in mind, of course, you can use any colours you want to for a scene like this, or any brands of paint. I'm just using this opportunity to show you our paints, as I'm very excited about them. So if you want to follow these colours with a different brand, then it's cobalt blue, raw sienna, Paynes grey, which we call our version of that Davidson's grey, and burnt umber. Now I've removed the tape, I think you can see that the painting works well. The strong composition of the line and wash with the beautiful trees works very well against those winter fields with that dry brush sparkle. If we look closely as well, the texture of the very sparse twigs and leaves just remaining on those winter trees is quite effective as well. The transparency of these paints is quite apparent as the various sort of layers and glazes work really well with each other. So don't forget to take a look at our new Etsy shop, linked below, and take a look at my daughter Morgana Rose Art's video if you're interested in watching a bit of the paint making process, and that's also linked below. We are both very excited about this new adventure and thrilled to be able to share it with you. I hope you enjoyed the demonstration itself, and I hope it was useful. And of course you could do this in any colours that you choose, or in pure watercolour if you prefer, rather than a line and wash. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to my lovely Patreon group who support this channel. And I'll see you again soon, and happy painting. Bye.